It's just a fever, she whispered, even though the silence in the room didn't believe her. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it should have, each second stretching thin across the dim apartment as Emily Carter pressed the back of her hand against her son's forehead again, hoping, praying, that it felt cooler this time, but it didn't, it never did, not in the last 2 hours, and the cheap plastic thermometer on the nightstand blinked 103.6 degrees Fahrenheit like a warning she couldn't turn off. The kind that sat in your chest and refused to leave, while outside the rain tapped steadily against the window, soft at first, then harder, like the night itself was closing in on her small one-bedroom apartment on the edge of Cleveland, where the hallway light flickered every few minutes and the heat barely worked, and everything felt just slightly too fragile to hold together much longer, especially her, especially tonight, because just 6 hours earlier she had been standing under fluorescent lights at the diner, wiping down tables with a forced smile, until her phone buzzed and everything changed, the babysitter's voice shaky on the other end. "Emily, I think Liam's really sick." And that was it. No hesitation, no calculation. She dropped the rag, grabbed her coat, and left without finishing her shift, knowing full well what that meant, knowing jobs like that didn't wait for mothers with emergencies. And now here she was, back home, paycheck already stretched too thin, rent due in 5 days, her car sitting useless in the parking lot with a dead battery she couldn't afford to fix, and a child burning up in her arms, her fingers trembling as she reached for the nearly empty bottle of children's fever medicine and shook it, listening to the hollow sound inside. One last dose, maybe less, not enough, never enough, and she exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that tried to hold back panic but couldn't quite manage it. "It's okay, baby," she murmured, brushing damp curls away from Liam's forehead as he whimpered softly, too tired to cry properly, too weak to complain, and that scared her more than anything, because silence in a child like that didn't mean peace, it meant something was wrong, something slipping, and she stood up quickly, grabbing her phone, dialing the nearest pharmacy, listening as it rang and rang before cutting to a recorded message. "We are currently closed." And she hung up before it finished, jaw tightening, trying another number, same result, another, nothing, and suddenly the room felt smaller, the air heavier, like the walls were pressing in with every failed call, and she glanced at the clock again, 11:12 p.m., and whispered under her breath, "Please," though she wasn't sure who she was asking anymore, and then, with shaking fingers, she opened her messages, scrolling past old threads, unpaid reminders, unanswered emails, until she found a contact she barely remembered saving, a number from weeks ago, when she had applied for a job and someone had told her to reach out if needed. And she hesitated, thumb hovering over the screen, because pride still lived somewhere inside her, quiet but stubborn. But Liam stirred in her arms, a weak sound escaping his lips, and that was enough. Pride didn't matter tonight, nothing did except him, and so she pressed record and spoke, her voice low, unsteady, barely holding together. "Hi. I'm sorry, I know it's late, I probably have the wrong number, but my son, he's sick, and I don't have any medicine left, and I can't get anywhere, and I don't know what else to do." And she stopped, swallowing hard, hating how small she sounded, how exposed, before adding quickly, almost as if to take it back, "It's okay if you can't help, I understand, it's late." And then she sent it before she could delete it, before she could think twice, and the message disappeared into the digital void, just another quiet plea in a world too busy to notice. And Emily lowered the phone slowly, her heart pounding in the silence that followed, because deep down, she already knew no one was coming. Miles away, on the top floor of a glass tower that never truly slept, Daniel Whitmore stared at the city stretched beneath him, a grid of headlights and reflections blurred by rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows, his phone resting face down on the polished desk while voices echoed from the conference call. Still active in the background, numbers being discussed, decisions waiting for his approval, millions moving with a single word, yet none of it held his attention, not tonight, not after the vibration that had interrupted everything just minutes ago, subtle but insistent, like something small demanding space in a world built for larger things. And when he finally flipped the phone over, expecting another update or delay or problem to solve, he instead found a voice message, unknown number, no context, just a waveform waiting to be heard, and for a moment he almost ignored it, his thumb hovering, because that was what he did, filtered, prioritized, eliminated what did not matter, but something in the timing, the lateness of the hour, made him press play, and the room seemed to shift the moment her voice filled the silence, quiet, uncertain, breaking slightly at the edges. Each word carrying a weight that no business proposal ever had, and behind her voice there was something else. Faint but unmistakable, the uneven breathing of a child, the kind that did not belong in a recording meant for strangers, and Daniel did not move as the message ended, did not speak, did not return to the call that was now asking for his input again. His name repeated twice by someone waiting on the other end, but he did not answer, because the sound of that voice lingered, pressing into a part of him he had learned to keep untouched, controlled, distant, and he set the phone down slowly before picking it back up again, replaying the message once more as if to confirm it had been real, as if it had not just been a moment of weakness slipping through the cracks of his routine. And when it ended again, the silence felt heavier than before, the kind that demanded a decision, and he exhaled quietly, running a hand through his hair before tapping the screen, opening the message thread. His fingers pausing above the keyboard as logic lined up quickly. It was late, too late, this could be anything, a mistake, a manipulation, a situation that did not involve him, and yet the image formed anyway, uninvited, a small apartment, dim lights, a mother trying to stay calm while something slipped out of her control, and he shut his eyes briefly, because that image did not come from imagination alone, it came from memory, distant but sharp enough to cut through years of carefully built distance, and without allowing himself to think further, he typed, simple, direct. "What is your address?" and pressed send before he could reconsider, before he could return to the safety of indifference, and the reply did not come immediately, which somehow made it worse, stretching the moment into something uncertain, until finally the message appeared, an address followed by hesitation even through text, and Daniel stood up abruptly, the chair sliding back with a quiet scrape against the floor as the voices from the conference call continued behind him, now distant, irrelevant, because he had already made a different decision, one that did not fit into schedules or projections, and he reached for his coat. Ignoring the assistant who stepped into the doorway, confusion written across her face as she asked if everything was all right, and he simply nodded once, already moving, already disconnecting the call with a single tap, leaving unfinished sentences and unanswered questions behind, and within minutes he was in the elevator, descending through layers of controlled space into the unpredictable night, rain heavier now, hitting the ground in steady sheets as he stepped outside, the cold air sharp against his skin. And for a brief second he paused, looking at the address again, at the unfamiliar street name in a part of the city he rarely entered, and something in him almost turned back, almost returned to what made sense, but instead he moved forward, unlocking his car, the engine starting with a low hum as he pulled into the empty street, headlights cutting through the rain, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel Whitmore was not driving toward a deal, or a meeting, or a future he could control. He was driving towards something uncertain, something fragile, something that depended on whether he showed up or not. Back in the apartment, the minutes did not pass, they dragged, each one heavier than the last as Emily sat on the edge of the worn couch with Liam resting against her chest, his small body radiating heat through the thin fabric of her shirt, his breathing uneven, too fast then too shallow, the kind that made her count without realizing, 1, 2, 3, waiting for the next rise of his chest like it was something she could will into happening, and her eyes kept drifting to the phone beside her, the screen dark now, silent, as if that message she sent had never existed at all. As if hope itself had been a mistake, and she pressed her lips together, trying to steady herself, trying not to spiral into that place where fear turned into something louder, something harder to control, because she could not afford to lose focus, not tonight, not when everything depended on her staying calm, staying present, even when her hands would not stop trembling, and she reached again for the thermometer, placing it carefully under Liam's arm, waiting through those endless seconds until it beeped, and when she looked down, her chest tightened. 104.1 degrees higher, worse, and she closed her eyes for a moment, just a moment, because she needed that pause to gather herself, to push back the rising panic that threatened to take over, and when she opened them again, she moved quickly, grabbing a damp cloth from the small kitchen sink, the water barely warm as she wrung it out and pressed it gently against his forehead, whispering soft reassurances that sounded more for her than for him. "It is okay, baby, I am right here, I am right here," repeating it like a promise she could not break, even as doubt crept in at the edges, because she knew this was not enough. She knew he needed more than comfort, more than cooling cloths and whispered words. He needed medicine she did not have, and help that had not come, and the silence of the apartment pressed in again, louder now, filled with every what if she tried to ignore. What if this got worse? What if she waited too long? What if she had done something wrong? And she shook her head slightly, refusing to let those thoughts take shape, focusing instead on the present, on the small weight in her arms, on the rhythm she tried to steady with her own breathing. But then her phone lit up. Suddenly, the screen glowing in the dim room, and for a second she froze, her heart jumping before she even reached for it, because part of her did not want to look, did not want to see another empty notification or something unrelated that would break whatever fragile hope had begun to form. But she picked it up anyway, her fingers hesitant as she unlocked it, and there it was, a message, simple, direct. "I am on my way." And she stared at those words as if they might disappear, as if they might change if she blinked, and her first instinct was disbelief, because people did not just do that, not for strangers, not in the middle of the night, not without questions or conditions, and yet the message was there, steady and certain, and something inside her shifted, small but undeniable, like a crack of light in a room that had been dark for too long, and she swallowed hard, her grip tightening slightly around Liam as she whispered again, softer this time. "It is going to be okay." Though she still did not know if that was true, not yet, but for the first time that night, it did not feel impossible either, and across the city, cutting through rain and empty streets, headlights moving steadily forward, the distance between them shrinking with every mile, with every second, with every choice that had already been made. The rain came down harder as Daniel's car turned onto narrower streets, the glow of downtown fading behind him, replaced by dim streetlights and quiet buildings that looked worn by time, the kind of places that did not show up in brochures or business reports. And he slowed slightly as he checked the address again, the numbers lining up with a row of aging apartment units, paint peeling at the edges, balconies cluttered with forgotten things. And for a brief moment he just sat there, engine idling, watching the building through the streaks of rain on his windshield, because this was not a world he moved through anymore, not for years, not since everything in his life had shifted upward into glass towers and controlled environments. And yet something about this place felt familiar in a way he could not ignore, something quiet and real that no amount of money could erase, and he reached for the paper bag on the passenger seat, checking its contents again, the fever reducer, the children's electrolyte drink, a digital thermometer, and without thinking too much about it, he had also added a small container of chicken soup from the only late-night grocery store still open, something warm, something simple. Something he remembered from a time when comfort did not come from solutions but from presence, and he exhaled slowly before turning off the engine, the sudden silence inside the car sharp compared to the storm outside, and then he stepped out, the rain hitting his coat immediately, cold and persistent as he moved quickly toward the entrance, his shoes splashing lightly through shallow puddles, and the door creaked as he pushed it open, the hallway inside dimly lit and quiet, the faint hum of an old fluorescent bulb overhead. And he followed the numbers down the narrow corridor until he reached the apartment door, pausing for just a second, his hand hovering before he knocked, because once he did, this became real in a way he could not step back from, and then he knocked anyway, firm but not loud, a simple sound that seemed to echo more than it should have in the stillness, and inside, Emily froze, her entire body going still at the unexpected sound, her breath catching as she looked toward the door, heart racing in a different way now. Because hope and fear had a way of sounding the same at first, and she tightened her hold on Liam instinctively, listening as the knock came again, steady, patient, not demanding, and for a moment she did not move, because every instinct she had learned told her to be careful, to not open doors to strangers in the middle of the night, to protect what little she had left, and yet the message still glowed faintly on her phone screen beside her. "I am on my way." And the timing, the presence, the quiet certainty of it all pressed against her hesitation, and she stood slowly, adjusting Liam in her arms, her steps cautious as she moved toward the door, the floor creaking softly beneath her weight, and she stopped just before reaching it, her hand resting lightly against the wood. Feeling the barrier between her world and whatever waited on the other side, and then a voice came through, calm, steady, close enough to feel real. "It is me," he said, not raising his voice, not pushing, just offering presence through a few simple words, and something about the tone, the absence of urgency or pressure, eased something inside her just enough, and she unlocked the door carefully, opening it only a few inches at first, enough to see him standing there in the hallway, rain still, clinging to his coat, his expression composed but softer than she expected, and for a second they just looked at each other, two strangers connected by a moment neither of them had planned, and then his eyes shifted gently to the child in her arms, concern passing through them in a way that did not need explanation, and he lifted the bag slightly, not stepping forward, not assuming, simply showing. "I brought what I could," he said quietly, and Emily felt something inside her chest loosen, just enough to let a breath through that she had been holding for hours, and without fully understanding why, she opened the door wider, allowing him into the small space where everything that mattered to her existed, and as he stepped inside, bringing with him the faint scent of rain and something steady she had not felt all night, the room did not feel as small as it had before. The door closed softly behind him, shutting out the sound of the rain, but leaving behind something else that lingered in the air, a quiet shift that neither of them acknowledged out loud, and Daniel stood just inside the small apartment for a moment, taking in the space without staring, careful, respectful, his presence steady rather than intrusive, while Emily moved quickly, almost instinctively, clearing a small space on the worn coffee table as if preparing for something she still was not entirely sure was real, and Liam stirred in her arms, a faint whimper escaping him as the heat radiating from his body pressed urgently against her again, pulling her focus back to what mattered most, and Daniel noticed immediately, his attention narrowing in a way that felt precise but not overwhelming, and he stepped closer only after she nodded slightly, a silent permission, setting the paper bag down and opening it with calm efficiency, his movements deliberate, controlled, the opposite of her trembling hands, and he took out the thermometer first, then the medication, reading the label quickly to confirm the dosage, before glancing up at her, his voice low and even. "How long has the fever been this high?" And she swallowed before answering, her voice quieter now but still strained. "A few hours it kept going up. I gave him the last dose earlier but it did not help." And Daniel nodded once, already processing, already adjusting. "We will try again, it is important to bring it down slowly," he said, not as a command, not as authority, but as reassurance shaped like direction, and Emily shifted slightly, lowering Liam onto the couch carefully while still supporting his head, her fingers brushing his hair back as if grounding herself through touch, and Daniel handed her the medicine, measuring it precisely before offering it to her rather than taking over, always giving her control, and she noticed that, even through the haze of exhaustion, and it mattered more than she expected, and she helped Liam take the dose, whispering softly to him as she did, her voice steadier now, anchored by the simple act of doing something that might help, and Daniel moved quietly to the kitchen sink, rinsing a cloth and bringing it back without needing to be asked, placing it gently into her hand, and for a few moments there were no words, only small actions, the kind that filled the space without demanding attention, the kind that built something unspoken between two people who had no reason to trust each other but did anyway, because of circumstance, because of necessity, because of something deeper either of them named, and Daniel checked the thermometer again after a few minutes, his eyes focused but calm as he read the number. Then nodded slightly. "It is starting to respond," he said, and Emily let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, her shoulders lowering just a fraction, the tension in her body easing in a way that felt almost unfamiliar after hours of constant strain. And she looked at him then, really looked, noticing the details she had missed before, the quality of his coat, the watch at his wrist, The way he carried himself with quiet confidence that did not need to be announced, and a question flickered briefly in her mind. Who he was, why he had come, what kind of person left everything to show up like this for someone he did not know, but she did not ask, not yet. Because right now the answers did not matter as much as the result unfolding in front of her, and Liam's breathing began to settle, still uneven but softer, less strained, and she brushed her thumb lightly over his cheek, her eyes stinging as relief slowly replaced fear, and Daniel stepped back slightly, giving her space as the moment shifted, as the urgency softened into something quieter, something that did not demand immediate action, and he reached into the bag again, pulling out the container of soup and setting it on the table. "You should eat something when you can," he said. Simply, not insisting, not expecting, just offering, and Emily blinked at that, surprised by the thoughtfulness of something so small, something so human, and for the first time that night, she allowed herself to believe that maybe she was not alone in this moment anymore, not completely, not the way she had been before the knock at the door changed everything. Time moved differently after that, slower but steadier, like the storm outside had shifted from chaos into rhythm, and inside the apartment the air felt warmer, quieter, no longer pressing in on Emily the way it had before, and she stayed close to Liam, one hand resting lightly on his chest, feeling each breath as it came, counting without realizing she was doing it again, but this time the rhythm was more consistent, less fragile, and every few minutes she would glance at the thermometer, almost afraid to check, almost afraid to hope, until finally she did, and when the number blinked back at her, 102.7, lower than before, not safe yet but moving in the right direction, and she let out a soft exhale, her shoulders dropping as if they had been carrying something heavy she could finally set down, even if only for a moment. And across from her Daniel sat quietly in the chair near the window, his presence steady, not intrusive, watching without staring, giving her space while still being there in a way that felt solid, dependable. And he glanced at the clock on the wall briefly before looking back at Liam, then at Emily, his voice calm when he spoke. "It is coming down, that is what we needed." And she nodded, unable to fully trust her voice yet, because relief had a way of catching in her throat just as much as fear did, and for a few minutes neither of them said anything, the silence now different, not empty but filled with small, meaningful things, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft rain against the glass, Liam's quieter breathing, and Emily became aware of something she had not felt all night, exhaustion, deep and sudden, settling into her bones now that the edge of panic had receded, and she leaned back slightly against the couch, her head resting for just a second before she caught herself straightening again as if she did not trust the moment to hold without her constant attention, and Daniel noticed that too, the way she stayed alert even when her body clearly needed rest, and he spoke again, softer this time. "You can sit back, I will keep an eye on him for a minute." And she looked at him quickly, hesitation flickering in her expression, not because she doubted him exactly, but because letting go, even briefly, felt unfamiliar, like stepping onto something uncertain, and he did not push, did not repeat himself, just held her gaze with quiet patience, and after a moment she nodded, just once, shifting slightly so she could lean back without losing contact with Liam entirely, her hand still resting lightly on his arm as if that connection anchored her, and her eyes closed for a second longer than she intended, opening again quickly. But that brief moment was enough to show how close she had been to breaking under the weight of it all, and Daniel reached for the glass of water on the table, setting it within her reach without saying anything, another small action that spoke louder than explanation, and she noticed, murmuring a quiet, "Thank you," that barely rose above a whisper, and he inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement, nothing more, because nothing more was needed, and time continued to pass, measured now not in fear but in gradual change, the numbers lowering, the tension easing, and eventually Liam stirred again, this time not with discomfort but with something softer, his breathing evening out as he shifted slightly against the pillow, and Emily leaned forward immediately, brushing his hair back again, her touch gentler now, less urgent, and Daniel checked the thermometer one more time, the reading steady, and he allowed himself a small nod, more to himself than to her, and then he looked toward the window, the rain beginning to lighten, the steady downpour softening into something quieter, almost like the night itself was easing along with everything else, and for the first time since he had stepped into the car hours ago, he felt the tension in his own chest loosen slightly. A subtle shift he did not fully acknowledge but could not ignore either, and he glanced back at Emily, at the way she watched her son with a mixture of relief and lingering fear, the way her entire world seemed to exist in that small space beside her, and something in that image stayed with him, something that did not fit neatly into logic or reason, and yet felt undeniable all the same, and he sat there in the quiet, not rushing to leave, not checking his phone, not returning to the world he had stepped away from, because for this moment, in this small apartment, what mattered was already right in front of him. The night did not end all at once, it softened gradually, like the rain outside easing into a quiet drizzle that barely touched the window anymore, and inside the apartment the silence had changed again, no longer tense or uncertain but gentle, almost protective, wrapping around the small space where Emily still sat beside Liam, her hand resting lightly on his arm as if she could feel the difference in him through that simple touch. And she could, his skin cooler now, his breathing steady. Each rise and fall no longer something she had to count in fear but something she could trust, and for the first time in hours she allowed herself to lean back fully against the couch, her eyes closing not from panic but from sheer exhaustion that had been waiting for permission to take over, and she stayed like that for a few seconds, maybe longer, before opening them again slowly, as if waking from something deeper than sleep. And when she did, she noticed Daniel still there, still in the same chair near the window, his posture relaxed but attentive. His gaze shifting briefly from Liam to her, as if checking that everything was holding, and she let out a quiet breath, something close to a small, tired laugh escaping her before she could stop it. "I think he is going to be okay," she said softly, the words sounding almost unfamiliar after everything that had come before, and Daniel nodded once, his expression calm but with a hint of something warmer beneath it. "He is," he replied simply, not overstating it, not turning it into something bigger than it needed to be, just stating the truth in a way that grounded the moment, and Emily looked down at Liam again, brushing her fingers through his hair gently, and then back up at Daniel, her gaze lingering a little longer this time, curiosity beginning to replace the urgency that had filled her before. Because now that the immediate fear had passed, the question she had pushed aside earlier returned quietly. Who was he? And why had he come? And she hesitated before asking, her voice careful. "You did not have to do this, you know." And he met her eyes without hesitation, his response coming without pause. "I know." And something in the way he said it, simple, without explanation, made her pause. Because it was not obligation or expectation that had brought him here, it was choice, and that realization settled into the space between them in a way that words did not need to fill, and she looked down briefly, nodding slightly as if acknowledging something she did not fully understand yet, and for a moment the room was quiet again. But this time it was not empty, it was shared, and Emily reached for the container of soup he had brought, opening it slowly, the warmth still lingering as she lifted the lid, the simple smell grounding her in a way she had not expected, and she took a small bite, more out of necessity than hunger, but even that small action felt like a step back toward normal, towards something stable, and Daniel watched quietly, not intruding, not commenting, just present, and after a moment she spoke again, softer now. "Thank you?" And this time the words carried more weight, more meaning than before, and he inclined his head slightly, acknowledging it without making it larger than it needed to be, and outside the first faint light of early morning began to edge into the sky, barely noticeable but enough to shift the darkness into something lighter, something that hinted at a new day, and Daniel glanced toward the window briefly before looking back at her, a subtle awareness passing through him that the night was ending, that the moment they were in could not last forever, and yet he did not move to leave just yet, not until he was certain everything was steady. Everything was safe, and Emily noticed that too, the way he stayed not out of obligation but out of quiet assurance, and something inside her, something that had been tight and guarded for a long time, eased just a little more, because sometimes safety did not come from familiarity, sometimes it came from someone choosing to stay when they did not have to, and in that small apartment, as the storm faded and the first light of morning began to rise, That choice lingered, quiet but undeniable, changing something in both of them without either one saying it out loud. Morning did not arrive with noise, it slipped quietly into the room, pale light filtering through the thin curtains, soft enough that it did not disturb the fragile calm that had settled over everything, and Emily noticed it only when she looked up from Liam, her eyes adjusting slowly as the darkness gave way to something gentler, something that felt like a second chance after a night that had stretched too long, and she shifted slightly on the couch, her muscles stiff from hours in the same position, but she did not move far, not yet, because Liam was still there beside her, his face finally relaxed, the tension gone, his breathing even and calm in a way that made her chest tighten again, this time not from fear but from quiet relief, the kind that came slowly, almost cautiously, as if she did not want to break it by acknowledging it too soon, and she brushed her fingers lightly against his forehead again, just to be sure, just to confirm what she already felt, cooler, steady, safe, and she let out a long breath, her shoulders sinking as the last of the tension left her body. And for a moment she just sat there, absorbing it, letting the silence settle into something peaceful, something she had not expected to feel again so soon, and then she became aware of movement across the room, subtle, careful, and she looked up to see Daniel standing near the window now, his coat in his hand, his posture quiet as if he had been waiting for this exact moment, waiting until everything was certain before allowing himself to step away, and their eyes met briefly. Understanding passing between them without needing words, because the night had already said enough. And Emily straightened slightly, a small hesitation in her movements as she realized what this meant, that he was about to leave, that whatever had existed between them in those hours was coming to its natural end, and she felt an unexpected weight in that realization, something she could not quite name, and she stood slowly, careful not to disturb Liam, her voice softer now but clearer than before. "You are leaving," she said, not quite a question, and Daniel nodded once, his expression steady, but not distant. "He is stable, the fever is down, he just needs rest now," he replied, his tone practical but not cold, grounding the moment in reality. And Emily glanced back at Liam briefly before returning her gaze to him, her fingers tightening slightly at her side as if holding on to something she did not want to let go of yet, and she stepped closer, not too close, just enough to close the distance that had once felt so vast, and she spoke again, the words coming slower this time, more deliberate. "I do not even know your name." And for a brief second there was a pause, as if that simple question carried more weight than it should have, and then he answered, "Daniel." Just that, no title, no explanation, just a name offered plainly, and she nodded, repeating it softly under her breath as if anchoring it. "Daniel." And then after a moment she added, "I am Emily." Though he already knew, though it had been spoken in the message that started everything, but saying it now felt different, felt real in a way it had not before, and he acknowledged it with a slight incline of his head, and the space between them shifted again, no longer strangers exactly, but not something defined either. Just two people connected by a night that neither of them had planned, and Emily hesitated once more before speaking. "I do not know how to thank you." And he shook his head lightly, almost immediately. "You do not need to," he said, his voice calm but firm in a way that left no room for obligation, and she held his gaze for a moment longer, searching for something she could say that would match what he had done, but finding nothing that felt enough, and so she simply nodded, accepting that some things did not need to be balanced or repaid, and he moved toward the door then, opening it quietly, the cool morning air slipping in for just a second before he stepped out, and he paused briefly, looking back once, not to say anything more but to make sure, to confirm one last time that everything was as it should be, and Emily stood there watching, her hand resting lightly on the back of the couch where Liam slept, grounding her in the life that had nearly slipped out of control just hours ago. And as Daniel walked down the hallway and disappeared from view, the apartment felt different again, not empty, but changed, like something had been left behind that could not be seen, and Emily closed the door softly, leaning against it for a moment as she let the quiet settle once more, and when she looked back at Liam, at the small rise and fall of his chest, she realized that the night had taken something from her, fear, helplessness, doubt, and in its place it had left something else, something quieter but stronger, the memory of a stranger who showed up when no one else did, and the understanding that sometimes, in the moments you least expect, someone can walk into your life without warning and remind you that you are not as alone as you thought. The apartment felt quieter after he left, not emptied but settled, like the air itself had exhaled along with her, and Emily stayed by the door for a few seconds longer than necessary, her hand still resting against the wood as if part of her expected another knock, another moment to stretch what had already ended. But none came, only the faint sound of footsteps fading down the hallway and then nothing. And she slowly pushed herself away, turning back toward the couch where Liam slept, the small rise and fall of his chest grounding her again, reminding her that what mattered most had been protected, and she moved closer, kneeling beside him, brushing her fingers lightly across his forehead one more time, still cool, still steady, and she closed her eyes briefly, letting that truth settle fully this time, not as hope, not as uncertainty, but as fact, and when she opened them again, the room looked different. Not because anything had changed physically but because something inside her had, something subtle but undeniable, like a shift in how she saw the space she had lived in for so long, the worn furniture, the chipped paint, the small kitchen barely visible from where she sat, all of it still the same, yet no longer carrying the same weight it had the night before, and she stood slowly, stretching her stiff muscles, moving toward the sink to rinse out the cloths she had used. The simple motion bringing her back into her body, back into the rhythm of ordinary things, and she caught a glimpse of herself in the small mirror above the sink, her reflection pale, tired, her hair pulled loosely back, eyes shadowed from lack of sleep, but there was something else there too, something softer, steadier, and she studied it for a second, almost as if she did not recognize it at first, before turning away, because there were still things to do, still a day ahead that would not pause just because the night had been different. And she moved back to the living room, glancing at the table where the empty medicine cup sat beside the container of soup, now half-eaten, and her phone lay there as well, screen dark again, but she picked it up, unlocking it slowly, her thumb hovering over the message thread that had changed everything, and she opened it, reading the short exchange again, the voice message she had sent, the simple reply that followed, and for a moment she considered typing something, a thank you, something more, something to acknowledge what had happened beyond the quiet words spoken in the early morning, but she stopped herself, her fingers stilling, because she did not know what to say that would not feel too small, too incomplete, and after a second she locked the screen again, setting the phone back down, understanding that some moments did not need to be extended, that some things could exist exactly as they were without being turned into something else, and she turned her attention back to Liam, adjusting the blanket over him gently, and as she did, he stirred slightly, his eyes fluttering open just for a second. Unfocused but calm, and he made a soft sound, something close to her name, and she smiled faintly, leaning down to press a light kiss against his hair. I am right here, she whispered again, but this time the words carried a different meaning, not a promise she was struggling to keep but a truth she could hold on to, and outside the morning had fully arrived now, light filling the room more clearly, the storm completely gone, leaving behind only damp streets and quiet skies, and somewhere in the distance the city began to wake, cars moving, doors opening, life continuing as it always did, unaware of what had happened in this small apartment during the night, and Emily sat back down beside Liam, watching him as he drifted back into sleep, her mind moving through everything that had unfolded, the fear, the uncertainty, the knock at the door, the quiet presence that followed, and she realized that while the night had been frightening, it had also given her something she had not expected, not just relief, not just help, but a reminder that even in the moments when everything felt like it was slipping beyond reach, there could still be someone willing to step in, not because they had to, not because it was their responsibility, but simply because they chose to, and that thought stayed with her as the day began, quiet but steady, like something she could carry forward long after the memory of the storm had faded. The rest of the morning unfolded quietly, almost carefully, as if the world itself understood that the night had taken more than it usually did and was now offering something gentler in return, and Emily moved through the apartment with slow, deliberate steps, checking on Liam every few minutes even though she knew the fever had broken, even though the steady rhythm of his breathing had not changed. Because letting go of that vigilance felt unfamiliar, like stepping away from something that had only just stabilized, and she paused by the couch again, watching him sleep, his small hand curled loosely against the blanket, his face no longer flushed but peaceful in a way that made her chest ache slightly, and she reached out to adjust the edge of the blanket once more out of habit than necessity, before finally stepping back and heading toward the kitchen, where she rinsed the empty medicine cup and set it beside the sink. The simple sound of water running filling the space in a way that felt grounding, normal, and she let it run for a second longer than needed, just to hold on to that sense of calm, before turning it off and drying her hands on a warm towel, and her gaze drifted again to the small table where her phone still rested, untouched since she had set it down earlier, and for a moment she stood there, considering it again, the message thread still lingering in her mind, the simplicity of it. The way something so small had shifted everything, and she picked it up once more, unlocking it slowly, her thumb hovering over the keyboard as she stared at the empty space where she could write something, anything, but the words still did not come, because how did you put something like that into a sentence? How did you take a night that had felt like it might break you and reduce it to a few typed words? And after a few seconds she let out a quiet breath, locking the screen again. Accepting that silence did not always mean absence, sometimes it meant understanding, and she set the phone back down gently, turning her attention instead to what was in front of her, because there were still responsibilities waiting, bills that had not disappeared overnight, a job she had left in the middle of a shift, a landlord who would not forget the date circled on the calendar, and she reached for the small stack of unopened mail near the counter, flipping through it quickly, her eyes scanning numbers and due dates that felt heavier now that the immediate crisis had passed, and she pressed her lips together, a familiar tension returning, quieter than before but still present, because life did not pause for relief, it continued, steady and unyielding, and she set the mail down again, exhaling slowly as she leaned back against the counter, her gaze drifting toward the window where the light had grown brighter, the sky clear now, the storm completely gone as if it had never been there at all. And she wondered briefly how something so intense could disappear so quickly, leaving behind only traces, damp pavement, a faint chill in the air, and memories that felt sharper than they should, and her mind returned again, unbidden, to the image of him standing in the doorway, the quiet certainty in his voice, the way he had not asked for anything in return, and she shook her head slightly, almost as if trying to clear the thought, because dwelling on it would not change anything, would not make the day ahead easier. And yet it lingered anyway, not as distraction but as something steadier, something she could not ignore, and she pushed herself off the counter, moving back toward the couch where Liam shifted slightly in his sleep, his eyes fluttering open just enough to find her before closing again, reassured simply by her presence, and she smiled faintly, brushing her fingers lightly across his cheek. "I am right here," she said softly, the words easier now, no longer weighed down by fear, and as she sat beside him again, the quiet of the apartment wrapped around them once more, not empty, not heavy, but full in a way that did not need explanation, and outside the city continued to move forward, unaware of the small, unseen moment that had taken place during the night, a moment that would not appear in headlines or conversations, but would remain with her, shaping the way she carried herself through everything that came next, because sometimes the most important changes did not arrive loudly, they came quietly, in the form of a stranger who showed up when it mattered most, and left without asking to be remembered, but stayed anyway, in the spaces that mattered. By late morning, the apartment had settled into a fragile kind of normal, the kind that did not announce itself but slowly rebuilt from small, ordinary actions, and Emily found herself moving through those actions almost automatically, rinsing dishes, folding a blanket, adjusting the curtains to let more light in. Each movement grounding her in the present while her mind hovered somewhere between what had happened and what still needed to be faced, and every few minutes she would glance toward Liam, still resting on the couch, his breathing steady, his cheeks no longer flushed, and each time she checked, the quiet reassurance returned, steady and real, and yet the rest of her life had not softened in the same way, it waited, unchanged, just beyond the edges of this moment, and she felt it again when her phone buzzed suddenly on the table, the sharp sound cutting through the calm, and she reached for it quickly, her fingers tightening slightly as she saw the name on the screen, the diner manager, and for a second she considered not answering, considered letting it ring out, but she knew she could not avoid it forever, so she swiped to accept the call, lifting the phone to her ear, her voice careful, controlled. "Hello?" And the response came immediately, clipped, impatient. "Emily, you left in the middle of your shift last night." And she closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself before replying. "My son was sick, I had to go." And there was a pause on the other end, not of understanding but of calculation, and then the voice returned flat. "We cannot have that kind of unpredictability, you know that." And she swallowed, her free hand tightening at her side, because she did know, she had always known the rules of places like that, reliability over everything. No exceptions, no room for circumstances, and she tried again, her tone softer but firm. "He had a high fever, I did not have a choice." And the response came just as quickly, colder this time. "We all have choices, Emily, and this job requires consistency. I am going to have to let you go." And the words landed heavier than she expected, not because she had not seen it coming, but because hearing them made it real in a way anticipation never did, and for a moment she did not speak, the silence stretching as she processed it, the practical implications already lining up in her mind, rent, groceries, everything that depended on that paycheck, and she exhaled slowly, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I understand," she said finally, though the words felt hollow, and the call ended shortly after, leaving the apartment quiet again, but different this time, the calm now edged with something sharper, something more uncertain, and she lowered the phone slowly, staring at it for a second, before setting it down on the table, her gaze drifting toward the small stack of bills again, the reality of them pressing forward with renewed weight, and she leaned back against the counter, her hand coming up to her forehead as she closed her eyes, not in panic, not the way she had the night before, but in something quieter, a steady pressure that built instead of breaking, and she stayed like that for a moment, letting the feeling pass through her without resisting it, because resisting would not change anything, and when she opened her eyes again, they moved instinctively to Liam, to the small, steady presence that had anchored her through everything, and she pushed herself upright, walking back to the couch and sitting beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm once more, grounding herself in what mattered most, and as she sat there, the events of the night shifted slightly in her mind. Not just as something that had saved her in a moment of crisis, but as something that had revealed a different kind of possibility, something she had not allowed herself to consider before, that help could exist without conditions, that kindness could arrive without warning, and that perhaps, even now, with everything uncertain again, she was not as alone as she had believed, and the thought did not solve her problems, did not erase the reality of what she had just lost, but it changed the way she faced it, even if only slightly, giving her something steadier to stand on as the day continued forward, one moment at a time. The afternoon light stretched further into the apartment, brighter now, less forgiving, revealing the small details Emily usually ignored, the worn edges of the couch, the faint stains on the carpet, the stack of unpaid bills still sitting on the table like quiet reminders that the calm she felt was temporary, and she sat there for a long moment, her fingers resting lightly against Liam's arm as he continued to sleep. His breathing steady, his face peaceful in a way that felt almost fragile. After everything, and she let herself watch him, just watch, as if anchoring herself to that single truth that had not changed, that he was okay, that he was safe, and that mattered more than anything else, and yet the weight of the rest of her life did not disappear, it pressed in slowly, returning with each passing minute, not urgent like the night before, but persistent, steady, and she knew she could not sit still forever. So she stood up, moving toward the small table again, picking up the stack of mail she had set aside earlier, flipping through it one more time, more carefully now, her eyes scanning each envelope, each number, each due date, and she let out a slow breath as she placed them back down, because nothing had changed there, nothing had softened, and she reached for her phone again, not out of habit this time, but with intention, her thumb unlocking the screen as she opened the message thread once more, staring at the simple exchange that had altered everything, and this time she did not hesitate as long, her fingers moving slowly across the screen as she typed, stopping, deleting, starting again, because she wanted the words to feel right, to carry the weight of what she had felt without sounding too much or too little, and finally she settled on something simple, something honest. Thank you for last night. I do not know what would have happened without you. And she read it once, twice, before pressing send, watching as the message disappeared into the same quiet space where everything had begun, and she set the phone down again, not expecting a reply, not needing one, because the act itself felt complete, like closing a circle that had been left open, and she turned back toward Liam, kneeling beside him once more as he stirred slightly, his eyes opening this time more fully, clearer. And he looked at her with a soft confusion that quickly settled into recognition, and she smiled gently, brushing her hand through his hair. Hey, you are feeling better, she said softly, and he nodded faintly, his voice small but stronger than before. I am not hot anymore. And she let out a quiet laugh, relief threading through it. No, you are not, she replied, and she helped him sit up slowly, adjusting the blanket around him as he leaned against her, his weight familiar, grounding, and for a moment they just stayed like that, her arms around him, his head resting against her shoulder, the simple closeness enough to quiet everything else, and outside the world continued to move, cars passing, distant voices carrying faintly through the open window, life unfolding as it always did, indifferent to what had happened inside these walls, and Emily held on to that small moment, letting it settle fully, because even with everything uncertain, even with the job she had lost and the bills waiting, there was still something steady, something real, and as she sat there, her mind returned briefly to the message she had sent, not with expectation, but with a quiet curiosity, a wondering that did not demand an answer, and she realized that whatever came next, whatever unfolded from here, the night had already changed something in her, something that would not disappear with the daylight, something that would remain quiet but present, shaping the way she moved forward, even when the path ahead was unclear. The message did not come immediately, and Emily did not expect it to, not really, because some things were not meant to be continued, some moments existed exactly as they were and then settled into memory without asking for more, and she placed her phone back on the table, turning her attention fully to Liam as he leaned against her, his small voice beginning to return, asking simple questions about the day, about breakfast, about whether he could have toast instead of oatmeal, and she smiled softly at that, at the normalcy of it. The quiet returned to routine that felt almost surreal after the intensity of the night, and she stood up carefully, guiding him to sit more comfortably as she moved into the kitchen, pulling out what little food they had, bread, a carton of eggs, a half-empty bottle of milk, and she worked slowly, deliberately, letting the simple act of making breakfast ground her in the present, the sound of the pan warming, the faint sizzle as she cracked the eggs, all of it steady, predictable, and Liam watched from the couch, quieter than usual but calm, his eyes following her movements as if reassured by the familiar rhythm, and for a while that was enough, just being there, together, in a space that felt safe again, and she placed the plate in front of him when it was ready, sitting beside him as he took small bites, his appetite not fully returned but present enough to ease the last of her worry, and she brushed his hair back again, her touch lighter now, more relaxed, and as they sat there, the quiet of the apartment was broken only by the soft sounds of morning. And then, unexpectedly, her phone buzzed again, the sound sharp in the stillness, and she glanced at it quickly, not expecting anything significant, but when she saw the message notification, her breath caught slightly, and she reached for it, unlocking the screen with a small, hesitant motion, and there it was, a reply, simple, direct. I am glad he is better. Please keep the medicine for the next dose. If the fever returns, do not wait. And she read it once, then again, something in the straightforwardness of it settling into her chest in a way she had not anticipated, because it was not just a response, it was a continuation of care, quiet but deliberate, and she typed back slowly this time, not overthinking, not searching for the perfect words, just speaking plainly. Thank you, Daniel. I will. And she paused before adding, you help more than you know. And she sent it, watching as the message disappeared, and this time she did not wait, did not stare at the screen. She set the phone down gently, because whatever came next did not need to be immediate, did not need to be defined right away, and she turned back to Liam, who looked up at her with a small smile. "Who was that?" he asked, and she hesitated for just a second before answering, her voice soft but steady. "Someone who helped us last night." And he nodded as if that was enough, because for him, it was, and she realized that maybe it was enough for her too, not knowing everything, not needing to understand every reason behind it, just accepting what had been given in the moment it was needed most. And outside the sun had fully risen now, light filling the room completely, chasing away the last shadows of the night, and Emily stood there for a moment, looking around the apartment again, at the same walls, the same furniture, the same life that still held its challenges and uncertainties, but felt different now, not because the circumstances had changed, but because something inside her had shifted, something steadier, something that reminded her that even when things seemed overwhelming, there could still be moments of unexpected kindness, moments that did not solve everything but made it possible to keep going. And she looked back at Liam, at the small, steady presence that anchored her, and she smiled again, softer this time, as the day moved forward, carrying with it the quiet echo of a night that had changed more than she could fully explain. And somewhere beyond the walls of that small apartment, Daniel Whitmore moved through his own day, returning to a world of meetings and decisions and expectations, but carrying with him something just as quiet, just as lasting, the memory of a door opened in the middle of the night. And the simple truth that sometimes, the most important thing a person can do is show up, without hesitation, without recognition, just because someone needed them, and in that choice, something real had been created, something that did not end when the night did, but continued quietly in the lives it had touched.